Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Richard C. Hoagland back with us, principal investigator, founder of the Enterprise Mission, as well as the vision and the voice of the program The Other Side of Midnight. He is the recipient of the Angstrom Medal and a former science advisor to CBS News and Walter Cronkite. Together with Carl Sagan, Richard has created the what is called the Pioneer Plaque and predicted life on Europa in his groundbreaking paper, The Europa Proposal, which was published 37 years before NASA's own announcement. His vision has inspired a whole new generation of pioneers of thought and form and opened the way for citizen scientists all around the globe. He's also an author, Dark Mission, The Monuments of Mars. Richard C. Hoagland, back on Coast to Coast. Richard, how are you?
George, how are you?
Good. It's good to hear your voice, my friend. Still up there in New Mexico doing your thing?
The land of enchantment, of course.
That's great. And The Other Side of Midnight you host on weekends, right?
Saturday night and Sunday night, 10 o'clock Mountain, for 3 hours. And we're worldwide in something like 190 countries.
Good for you. And people can find it on your website, The Other Side of Midnight?
Certainly can.
Perfect. Well, you heard Dr. Sky talking about the Artemis space situation. What is that?
Well, it's really bizarre because this is like the gang that can't shoot straight. Remember, I was a very, very tiny part of the actual Apollo program 50 years ago. In fact, if you go to wherever you link up to the images and web links for tonight's show, Item 1 and 2 is the official Grumman Aerospace Engineering press book on the lunar module, which Grumman built for NASA to land the astronauts on the moon. Grumman came to me when I was working for Cronkite at CBS, and they said, would you like to write the section of the press book, which went to every press person on the planet? Would you like to write the section on the moon? And I said, is the Pope Catholic? And I wound up doing it, and it was nominated for an Aviation Space Writers Award for 1969. Now, you know what they always say. It's not winning, it's the nomination, right?
It's the nomination.
I did not win because there were a lot of other people in the race, but to be nominated, really, for something so incredibly historic. And I was sending this to Lex this afternoon, actually, to Ryan, who is working
He's
tonight.
filling in for Lex.
Lex is on vacation.
Yes, sir.
And I started reading it. And, I wrote this thing half a century ago, and it holds up. It's item number 2. If you click on item number 2 in my materials tonight, it takes you right to the Grumman Press Book section on the moon, which described what the moon was, what we thought it was in 69, why we should care to go there, what we thought we'd find out, and what we would do beyond the moon. And it's 50 years old when I wrote this.
Your vision has always been uncanny, Richard.
So I got a really close-up look at Apollo, right? I was a teeny tiny part of the Apollo program to land men on the moon. And I'm looking at this current program, and I'm asking myself, what is wrong with these people? And I've come to the conclusion, and I've said this on my show several times since August when they were going to try to launch it the first time.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be a ritual. There's got to be a reason why they have delay until the magic moment in their minds when they can go. And the next opportunity was supposed to be en route to the moon tonight. Remember?
That's right.
We were going to do the show while they were literally, doing the Frank Sinatra thing, fly me to the moon. And it got postponed because of Hurricane Nicole. If it isn't one thing, it's another. So they survived the hurricane. Long story, good ending. And they're going to try to launch it at 1:04 a.m. Wednesday morning, which is really late Tuesday night, East Coast time, 3 hours earlier West Coast time. And what really bums me out is if they launched it early this morning, it would have been in the first 7 minutes of my show live, the other side of midnight, all around the world.
Wow. What timing that would have been.
It would have been incredible because, of course, that's the stuff I used to do for Cronkite. And the Artemis program, as the successor to Project Apollo, I mean, you realize what Artemis is, right?
Well, I was going to ask you, does it have any special meaning? What does that mean?
Artemis is the twin sister of the Greek god Apollo.
Aha.
She's the goddess of the moon.
There you go.
It's like bookends, except poor Artemis can't get it off the ground. And I'm telling you, given the fact that this is 40-year-old technology, the basis of the Apollo, moon rocket, which is called in NASA speak SLS, Space Launch System, is 40-year-old hydrogen, technology, hydrogen fuel technology that was pioneered even before the shuttle flew back in the Centaur program. And they've had one damn hydrogen leak problem after another. Frankly, I didn't have time before the show to look, but I'm wondering if it might slip again because the next opportunity is late Friday night on the 19th or early pre-dawn Saturday, technically. And I'm just wondering if they're waiting for the right ritual window to launch this sucker, because if Artemis does get to the moon, it kicks off a whole series of events that are going to culminate in my research in ancient lunar artifacts, the work of other nations separately sending an unmanned spacecraft to the moon in the same time frame, the South Korean Space Agency, and a little teeny tiny satellite that Dr. Sky just mentioned, the CubeSat called Capstone, which of course is another ritual stand-in for. I mean, what do you think of when you hear the word capstone?
The top of the pyramids.
Exactly, because there are pyramids on the moon. They just weren't built by us.
Now, what exactly is the Artemis mission? What will it encompass?
Well, unlike Apollo, which was basically where they used to have the kind of flip saying flags and footprints, our longest mission to the moon was like less than a week, and then we came home with the Apollo astronauts, two guys down in the lunar module on the surface, and one guy who kind of manned the fort in the command module orbiting the moon, while the two other astronauts were on the surface. The Artemis program, if it goes the way it's supposed to, is going to be the opening to permanent human habitation in the modern era of the moon.
When do you think that'll be?
Well, the current plan, if they can ever get this first one off the ground, the first one is an unmanned test that will last anywhere between 25 days and 42 days, depending upon which launch window they launch in. There are certain constraints about entering the Earth's shadow for more than 90 minutes, which determines how long they can stay in orbit before they come home. But the idea is they're going to test the entire system with this unmanned launch, either early Wednesday morning or early Friday morning, and then they will spend between 25 and 42 days orbiting the moon. In fact, if you go to my item number 3 in my materials, you can see the outline of the trajectories going from the Earth to the moon. and going around the moon for 2 or 3 long 7-day orbits and then coming home, as opposed to Apollo, which went in 3 days, went to the moon, landed, and came back home all within like 2 weeks.
How are they going to land this thing back here, Richard?
Well, they're going to have the same kind of reentry system that they had on Apollo, because you have basically the rocket, you've got the
and then the parachutes,
Orion, command module. The European Space Agency built the service module, which basically contains the power supply, oxygen, water, things like that. That's all discarded before you re-enter the atmosphere. So the Orion spacecraft looks kind of like the conical Apollo spacecraft, but it's much bigger, and it in fact can contain up to 7 astronauts as opposed to 3 maximum for the Apollo mission. And we only ever flew 3. In the unmanned area, they're doing brilliantly. A little later on, we're going to talk about the so-called DART mission.
Yes.
Which was incredibly successful. In fact, it was so beyond belief successful, I'm going to knock your socks off with what I think they were really up to. We've had unmanned probes to Saturn, unmanned probes to Jupiter, the Juno probe, and there was brilliant unmanned spaceflight all over the solar system, including 2 rovers on Mars, Curiosity and Perseverance. But in the man game, in the people business, it's been abysmal. And again, I think it's because we're dealing with a handicap that most of the system doesn't even know it's operating under. I said a little while ago before the break that it looked to me like there was some reason to delay the launch of this Artemis test mission. And in part, it may be that NASA is being, this is going to sound bizarre, sabotaged by the fact that it does not know what it does not know. If, as I've said over and over again, 90+% of the system is honest, you've got scientists, engineers, administrators, incredibly dedicated people who function beyond, their capacity, 110%. And they don't look at the clock, and they work overtime, and they make incredible miracles happen beyond the earth. But the thing that's handicapped them is they do not know, because those at the top have not let them know, that there are artifacts built by ancient extraterrestrials all over the solar system, beginning with the moon.
As Ingo Swann said a long time ago.
Remote viewer, SRI. I met him at the UN one evening at a cocktail party. Fascinating guy.
Yep.
Anyway, by the way, he verified that I'd found stuff on Mars. He'd remote viewed things on Mars, and he said something really bizarre. He said they're still functioning. The technology that this ancient culture or cultures used literally never wears out. It's negentropic. It does not succumb to friction or rust or degradation like our technology. So, and Ingo had no way of knowing that that's what we figured out from the physics side. So when he said there's actually some stuff still functioning, I said, well, this guy really knows what he's talking about, because he had no way of knowing, unless he saw it or connected with it through the same physics that we worked out mathematically. Anyway, so you want to grade NASA. I think they're operating under this incredible limitation that someone does not want them to succeed in the very program that's going to confirm everything we've been saying on this show, and, of course, my show now, The Other Side of Midnight, for decades. Let me give you one example.
All right.
If you go to my item tonight, number 4, you're sitting in front of the computer. You see number 4, right? It's an enlargement of the right side of number 3.
Well, for folks, it's in our highlight reel at coasttocoastam.com.
Yeah, this is an overview of the Artemis mission, the Artemis 1 unmanned mission. They're supposed to go into a lunar orbit, which will take them 7 days to go around the moon once, from a low point of about 60 miles to a high point. Do you see that number there on the screen, George? 39,000 miles between the orbit of Artemis and the center of the moon.
Yes.
Does that ring any bells? 39,000 miles? If you divide it by 2, what do you get? 19,000.5. 19.5. These guys can't go to the men's room without a ritual. So they're all bound up in this ancient stuff that 99% of the institution doesn't even know they're doing. And I think they've been permanently kept from going back to the moon until a certain window when the unmanned Capstone mission, which arrived Sunday, is on station, and right before the unmanned Danuri mission from the South Koreans arrives in lunar orbit with an incredible set of cameras to begin taking pictures all over the place, particularly at the South Pole. Now, you know, and actually let's skip down to item number 8. The Capstone mission, as Dr. Sky said, arrived successfully on station, was put into lunar orbit on Sunday afternoon. That carries a set of experiments, one of which is a very high-quality camera, which totally independent of the Artemis mission, which carries something like a dozen high-quality digital HD cameras. There's no way spending 7-day orbits for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, they can avoid seeing and sending back via live streams to Earth amazing view of the glass ruins that are on the moon. So if you know that it's inevitable once they take up station that this is going to be seen by people all over the world through NASA television, what would you do if you needed it to happen only after a certain time? You'd have to create delays. Delays that were not fatal, but delays that would stretch out the time frame so it launched and got there in the right window. And that's frankly what I think we're dealing with tonight.
That's an interesting take on all of that. And what about the private space companies? How would you grade them? Bezos' company, Musk's?
Well, up until Musk is self-destructed with Twitter,
yeah,
I thought he was the inside track to really showing us what's on the moon and opening the gateway, pun intended, to the whole solar system in terms of what's really out there. And then something has happened to Musk. It's like he's lost his mission, which is SpaceX, with Tesla kind of on the side, and he's now doing this bizarre thing with Twitter that frankly makes zero sense. You know that he and Joe Rogan spent a half hour several months ago talking about me and my research, right?
I heard about that.
And it was bizarre because although they panned it, Rogan just happened to have handy to put up on the screen a copy of the cover of my book. Now, you've been in the business long enough to know, like in politics, this stuff does not happen by coincidence.
That's right. There are none.
So I've been watching Musk and these incredible permutations of bizarreness.
It is bizarre. He's obsessed.
And the only thing I can think of is either he's just been brainwashed, someone slipped him a Mickey and, he's out in La La Land, or, and this is even more intriguing, what if he's trying to deliberately smash Twitter?
For $44 billion?
Yeah, but he can make that up out of petty cash. Remember, it's not real money. None of the money that's out there now is real money. Look at what happened to crypto.
I know
one
it.
Day it's up,
I know
one
it,
day
but that's
it's down.
still a lot of paper money.
Go ahead.
It's still a lot of digital funny stuff.
A lot of digital funny stuff, but if you basically want to break the stranglehold of disinformation in social media, how would you do it?
You buy it.
and then you break it.
Or put in your own
Deliberately
thing.
break it, so that you have to have a whole bunch of competing companies that take up the slack, and they watch what happens as it self-destructs, self-immolates, goes up in flames, and they promise never to do that. They hire the right people, and you have a social medium which is managed so that you have truth and honesty and real information, and the crazies are put in a lockbox and they throw away the key.
Now, you mentioned the incredible DART mission, which was our asteroid defense test, which was very successful. But you think there might be something else going on here?
Oh, are you kidding? Let me scroll down. Okay, I don't want to leave the moon quite yet because they're actually related. Okay, if you look at item number 6, all right, see what it says there? The CIA secret Corona program.
Yep.
Back when Eisenhower was trying to negotiate with the Russians, with the Soviets, over what was called open skies, where we would fly airplanes over the Soviet Union, and they would fly airplanes over the United States to check on each other's H-bombs and missiles and bombers and all that to prevent World War III. The Soviets said no. So what Eisenhower did is he turned to the CIA and he said, how can I get pictures of what's really going on inside the Soviet Union? And they said, Mr. President, well, we know the high flying U-2 doesn't work because the Russians
for Gary Powers, right?
Got one down with Gary Powers. So they said, okay, we got to go higher. How about a secret satellite program? And he said, go for it. It wasn't until John Kennedy's first year that the CIA and the Air Force perfected putting a satellite in orbit with a huge roll of film, taking lots of pictures, looking down at Soviet missile sites and airfields and dams and factories and all that, and then launching the film back to Earth to be picked up by an airplane, flown to Langley, developed, and then photo interpreters poured over the prints to see what the Russians were hiding. That's how we found out that the famed missile gap that was part of the Kennedy
the Cuban Missile Crisis, wasn't it?
Well, that was later, but the so-called missile gap that brought Kennedy into the White House turned out to be non-existent because the Russians didn't have anywhere near what the CIA had said they had just a few years before. Many, many years later, decades later, I was at a conference where someone came up to me and they said, how would you like to have some original film from Project Corona?
Wow.
And I said, is the Pope Catholic? So we got the film. Long story, don't have time to go into it tonight. And when I started looking at it, I was dumbfounded because I'd expected, top secret film, which, of course, the Clinton people had declassified. President Clinton had declassified Corona back in the 1990s. So I wasn't looking at top secret stuff, unlike a certain ex-president sitting at Mar-a-Lago. I had a perfect right, like an American citizen, to look at this film because it had been declassified by the President of the United States. But I still wanted to see what our capabilities were. And what I was dumbfounded was that I wasn't looking at bridges or dams or airfields in the Soviet Union. Every single frame of film taken from Earth orbit, and now you need to go to my number 7, and the third panel over on the right where it says Project Corona, had been taken of the moon. What the hell was Project Corona doing, taking pictures from Earth orbit across 250,000 miles of the moon? And, of course, when I looked at it, I realized what they were doing, because the CIA was doing early reconnaissance work before we could send spacecraft to the moon of the structures on the moon that you can see from Earth if you're in space.
Now, is it just backside?
No, it's all over.
All over the place. Huh?
All over. And it's seen best on the limb. So that brings me to number 9. This is a color image taken by NASA in the fall of 2009 from a mission called Lacrosse that went to the moon, looped around the moon, smashed a spacecraft into the moon to see if it would raise a plume of material that had water in it. And then they photographed and did spectrometry with a follow-on satellite to basically look for volatiles and other things that a future lunar base on the moon that Artemis is going to be setting up when it gets going could undertake. But, of course, that to do that, you need to find resources on the moon to utilize. And Lacrosse did that. But before it crashed onto the moon, it took some amazing color images, and number 9 is one of them. Do you see all that color?
Oh, it's gorgeous.
It's glass. That's the damn glass at the south pole of the moon, photographed by NASA's unmanned spacecraft called Lacrosse, which is where the Artemis mission number 3 is planning to land the first woman and the first person of color with a United States flag sewn on the shoulder of their spacesuits in the Artemis program. Artemis mission number 3, which will reach the moon now, according to the NASA timetable, sometime in 2025.
That's not too long away.
After the next election. Timing, timing, timing.
Richard, the glass that you were talking about, created by an implosion or artificially made?
No, artificially made. I mean, remember, our model is that the moon is covered with glass ruins, ancient, meteor-bashed, artificial ruins, all right? Now, what's one of the key things about glass that you can't disguise? Glass creates colors, prisms.
Prism colors, yeah.
When you shine light at any angle in a glass surface, there's an automatic prism because of the angle between the light and the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the light interfering with each wavelength, so you get different than the primary colors. You get pastels, you get pastel yellows and violets. And in other words, look at that picture. It's like you looked at a glass chandelier on a beautiful afternoon with the light coming in the dining room windows. So Artemis is going to land down there toward the lower right-hand corner. That's where they want to put the moon base. Why? Because some of those craters never see sunlight. There's immense amounts of water and oxygen and nitrogen and hydrocarbons and mercury and a whole bunch of other elements there. We know that from the Lacrosse mission. You can use it to drink, to breathe, to create rocket fuel, to fuel industries, to create chips. You can do incredible industrial things on the moon if there's the natural resources. Well, Lacrosse tells us back in 2009 that the south and north pole of the moon, unlike the barren places we land on during Apollo around the lunar equator, it's the poles where all the action should be, because that's where all the volatiles have been stored for billions and billions of years. So that's where they're going to go, provided they can get down and land through the glass. And that's where the South Korean mission comes in. Remember, there are 3 missions heading back to the moon. The CubeSat called Capstone is already in lunar orbit.
Right.
Artemis is supposed to launch Wednesday morning, carrying all its cameras for a month-long or longer set of lunar orbits, close up and far away, with all its cameras. The third mission, which gets there in mid-December, is the South Korean mission called Danuri, which is a fusion of 2 Korean words, which means, get this, George, enjoy moon.
I thought it was named after me for a moment.
Hey, that's not bad.
Not bad
anyway, at all. The Danuri mission, the South Korean mission, carries a 33-pound camera from Mike Malin, Remember Mike Malin?
Oh yeah, he was part of the Face on Mars, right?
Yes, yes. Anyway, it's a 33-pound camera called a shadow cam, which is supposed to look down from a 60-mile orbit when Denuri gets there in mid-December and goes into the 60-mile circular orbit, looking down on the South and the North Pole every couple of hours as they orbit the moon, and takes pictures in the shadows by reflected scattered light from the surrounding sunlit rims of the craters. The camera will be 800 times more sensitive than any camera, any digital camera or film camera we've ever sent to the moon before. It's supposed to be able, according to Malin, to look into the shadows and see where the ices are and the volatiles and the topography. So if you land in the dark, you'll be able to see where to land so you don't land in a crater and tip over and blow the whole mission. But if you're really looking to see where there are holes in the glass domes, this is exactly the kind of camera you would need to look through the holes and see where it's safe to land down through the openings. And that's what the shadow cam, which I think is incredibly aptly named, is supposed to do. In other words, we're on the verge, George, of everything I've been talking about on this show for the last 20 years coming true on live television.
Just in a matter of moments, too.
It's just like
here it is.
Day after tomorrow. And I think they're all coordinating with, so it all arrives at the same time, which is why the initial attempts to launch Artemis in August by people that did not know the bigger game plan.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and did I mention NASA's opened a full official UFO study just down the hall? And one of the members of the scientific board is a guy named Scott Kelly. Does that name ring a bell?
He's an astronaut, isn't he?
His brother just got reelected to the U.S. Senate of the United States.
Mike Kelly.
Mark Kelly.
Mark, yeah.
Who's married to Gabby Giffords. So it's all part of a larger picture, but no one person at a lower level imagines that this is being coordinated, let alone understands the end point of the coordination. And the only reason I think we have a look in is we've spent decades doing almost nothing but trying to figure out what the hell are they up to and why don't they just tell us the truth.
Well, maybe one day we'll squeeze it. Now, give me your thoughts on the DART mission, the asteroid defense system, which appeared to be very successful.
The idea was we send a vending machine-sized spacecraft on a 10-month journey from Cape Canaveral to an asteroid, actually a double asteroid, a large one about half a mile across, orbited by a smaller one about 600 feet across, orbiting around it as a satellite and a primary. You got it? Got the picture?
Amazing mathematics to even
And the
crossfire.
idea was that if you carefully guide with an onboard guidance system the NASA spacecraft into a collision with the smaller satellite asteroid, you know very precisely its period of orbit before you get there from literally years and years of observations of this twin system from the Earth. And the smaller one orbited the bigger one every 11 hours, 55 minutes. With me so far?
So far.
The idea was that if you smash your vending machine spacecraft into the little one at about 4 miles per second, the transfer of kinetic energy would basically change the orbit of the smaller object orbiting the bigger object, and that would result in a period change that then could be observed over ensuing months by telescopes from Earth, and the amount of change would tell you the efficiency of what was called the kinetic impacting method as a means of changing the trajectory of any asteroids in the future that might be discovered on an impact course with Earth, where if you nudge them out of the way with enough warning, they miss the Earth, they don't hit the Earth, and therefore we do not all have, like the dinosaurs, a very bad hair day.
There is a danger, though, that when you blow up an asteroid, you create like a shotgun pellet effect, and they spread all over the place. No, this one was too far away.
This is why you want to do it very far away. And
Exactly.
the earlier, the better.
Yes.
And this was done with the objects in orbit 7 million miles away. They can never get any closer. It was about as close as it comes to Earth right now. It was the perfect, safe target, except when they hit the smaller object called Dimorphos with the vending machine-sized spacecraft called DART, all hell broke loose, which you can see in this photograph. And, of course, you're going to say, well, if they destroyed the spacecraft with the collision, how do we get this picture? Because the DART spacecraft dropped a little CubeSat out the back door.
That kind of followed along, right?
About 10 days before the encounter. And that little spacecraft had two cameras called Luke and Leah. Where have you heard those names before?
Skywars.
And they took the pictures that we're seeing, one of which we're seeing on the screen. Now, here's what really happened. When they smashed their big spacecraft into Dimorphos, the 600-foot wide satellite of the half-mile Didymos main asteroid, all hell broke loose because they released an extraordinary amount of hyperdimensional energy. How do I know this? Because I followed up the work of Bruce De Palma decades ago, and the Russian, his counterpart in the old Soviet Union, Nikolai Kozyrev, and they discovered that when you have rotating systems that are rotating around each other, when you change their properties, when you bump into them, when you exert an exterior force, you wind up releasing a tremendous amount of excess energy, exactly like a perpetual motion free energy device.
Interesting.
In other words, NASA conducted, either knowingly or unknowingly, a hyperdimensional solar system experiment. And I'm betting they didn't know what they were doing, because when you saw the face of all the experimenters, who of course were
they were in shock and awe.
They were in shock.
Yeah.
And there has been zero information published about the ensuing effects of the experiment in the 2 months since the successful impact. I even have certain people who are able to make calls and get right to the top of NASA, to the experiment, and they have not had their phone calls returned. And they've asked very simple, questions about what else did they see during the impact. Nobody is talking about anything, because I think, frankly, remember, 99% of the system is honest. The 1% that's manipulating things doesn't let the other 99% know. So they were freaked out by what they got, because they never imagined in their wildest calculations they would get what you see on the screen.
Great stuff. Have you ever met Buzz Aldrin, Richard?
No, but he and a friend of mine, a Hollywood producer, had a knockdown, drag-out fight in the middle of the Kodak Theater one night during the Academy Awards.
Over the moon landing?
Over whether Buzz saw ruins.
Ah.
And he insisted that I was a liar and a blowhard and a con artist and all that. And my producer friend was defending me, and a whole bunch of people in white tie and tails and gowns and all that were clustered around. I see these two guys literally on the red carpet at the Academy Awards were having essentially a verbal knockdown, drag-out over was Hoagland crazy or was he onto something?
You're not crazy. You come up with some very perplexing, interesting thoughts, but you're not crazy.
Tune in Sunday night and tell me afterwards.
Yeah, far from that. You still using that mystical music?
Of course.
That's great.
You know where that's from, don't you?
It's from Lost in Space?
No, Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, that's it. One of those. Yeah, you've been using that for years now, haven't you?
Well, you know who originally used it, don't you?
Yes.
Long John Nebel.
Yep, that's a long time ago.
Homage to Long John, who I used to listen to under the covers with a flashlight, so my mom and dad wouldn't catch me staying up past bedtime. I used to listen to WOR right across the river when we lived in New Jersey, and it obviously stuck with me. I'm of the opinion now that we have two space programs. The real one, the secret one, the deep state one, and then the NASA one, which is kind of fake because we're using rockets, they can't even get a gasket to work right after 40 years working with liquid hydrogen. Come on. So NASA's like a false front western town where we're all supposed to look like Randy the Magician. The right hand keeps you from seeing what the left hand is doing. So there's a real program and a fake program. The fake program, to a certain extent, is what we see in NASA. The real program, the secret space program, the deep state program, is the one where they really explored the ruins, prescinding from, remember, the CIA took the photographs of the ruins on the moon over half a century ago.
Wow.
And that's why Kennedy suddenly, out of nowhere, said, we're going to the moon.
He said that in May of 61, didn't he?
May 25th, 1961.
We choose to go to the moon. Great stuff.
We just didn't choose to do it in secret, and that's why they killed him. The moon was brought here. We think we can calculate exactly when. We'll talk about that Saturday night. Is there anybody on the moon now? Probably the breakaways. We think they've established a base. But remember who the breakaways are. They're the Nazis that left the Earth using the hyperdimensional technologies that they, developed during World War II. And at the end of the war, they abandoned the Earth, set up outposts on the moon, on Mars, or whatever, and they've been out there for 70-plus years. And so I think they're the ones that are on the moon. Are genuine extraterrestrials on the moon? Maybe, maybe not.
What do you think of the hollow Earth theory, Richard?
I don't. I think that in terms of the moon, there was a natural object on which a lot of artificial stuff was built, kind of like the planet Trantor in Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And the artificial stuff could go as deep as 40 or 50 or 100 miles, but the moon itself is not hollow.
Do you think the moon is natural, even though you believe it was towed into place, or do you think it's artificial?
Remember, if you can control gravity and inertia, you can tow anything anywhere. It doesn't matter the mass, because you change the mass through the application of the hyperdimensional technology.
If you have that kind of technology, that's right.
Yep. The X-37B is the Air Force supplement for what used to be the space shuttle. And we're told that it's this unmanned, much smaller craft. They launch it on a very heavy rocket into orbit. It stays in orbit for, in this case, years. And then they bring it down by remote control. They don't relay any data from the satellite while it's in space. They basically store it digitally on board, and then they bring it home, so there's no telltale radio signals to tell anybody where it is or where it's been or where it's going, right?
True.
I realized years ago that it was another Shaggy Dog story. The X-37B, I do not think, is a spy satellite in Earth orbit or a long-term exposure facility or whatever. I think it's a secret reconnaissance of whoever is on the moon. And I think they send it out for long orbits. They take imagery, radar data, other sensory data. They store it on board, and then they bring it home and download the data so no one sees it in space. And the way I know this is when you look at the launch vehicle required to send it into orbit, it's the biggest rocket that the Air Force could procure at the time it was buying rockets to send it into space. It was such overkill for only going into low Earth orbit, but it in fact was just about adequate to send it to and from the moon. 2029 is quite a ways off. Can you imagine the extraordinary unveilings and revelations if we have a technology that doesn't require rockets, can actually change the mass and trajectory of mass in space by application of a field? Then Apophis and no other asteroid threatens us ever again, and we do not need to worry about a close encounter. Well, one of the things I'd like would be for Elon Musk to kind of straighten up and fly right and take me along as one of his tourists when he sends the Starship into lunar orbit. DART did not hit 2 asteroids. In fact, it hit 2 ancient spacecraft, which were placed in orbit as a time capsule for humanity to go into and read the contents before we destroyed it. And NASA, instead of doing all that, they simply blew it up. That's why I'm hoping that the secret space program went there first, emptied the archive, and left the relic to NASA to do with what they will. But there are actual numbers I can document that these were not 2 asteroids whirling around each other. They were 2 ancient spacecraft. And when you see the evidence, it's stunningly beautiful and simple and overwhelmingly confirming.
Richard, do you use enterprisemission.com anymore, or
yes,
simply you do use that too? Okay.
Yep.
But you've got the other side of midnight.
The other side of midnight is where the action is.
That's your action stuff. Okay, Richard, we're wrapping things up. I want to take this quick moment and thank you for the years of service and dedication to this program that you have done, because you've done just a fantastic job. I want to thank you personally.
Well, thank you, George, and I want to tell you that you're on the brink of where we've all been going, because this is the end game.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.